This video is brought to you by Wicket Cricket Manager. Join our new YouTube channel, Jarrod Kimber Podcast. Engage with live recordings or listen to the thought-provoking chats 4 times a week, exploring shows like Wagon Wheel, Uncovered, Footmarks and Red Inker. They cover everything from fan questions, weekend stories, articles, videos, what's going on in cricket, and just anything we want to talk about when it comes to the bat and ball game. Want to have live chats with me or just connect with other cricket fans on Discord that also enjoy my content? Or a few AMAs. Maybe you want early podcast episodes or ad-free content or want to receive my emailer. You can get all of this on our Patreon, plus a little bit of behind the scenes stuff as well. Huge thanks to everyone who has supported us on Patreon so far. You are all part of this channel's success. This video is brought to you by Wicket Cricket Manager. Join our new YouTube channel, Jarrod Kimber Podcast. Engage with live recordings or listen to the thought-provoking chats 4 times a week, exploring shows like Wagon Wheel, Uncovered, Footmarks and Red Inker. They cover everything from fan questions, weekend stories, articles, videos, what's going on in cricket, and just anything we want to talk about when it comes to the bat and ball game. Want to have live chats with me or just connect with other cricket fans on Discord that also enjoy my content? Or a few AMAs. Maybe you want early podcast episodes or ad-free content or want to receive my emailer. You can get all of this on our Patreon, plus a little bit of behind the scenes stuff as well. Huge thanks to everyone who has supported us on Patreon so far. You are all part of this channel's success. Welcome to Wagon Wheel, and hopefully you can hear me now. I'll have to go back to the comments to make sure. I thank you to who do we have at the comments? Amit, Miraj, Vasht, who else? For everyone else that we had. Apparently, I had no sound, so I've been doing this recording for 16 minutes. But there was an issue with I've got a new computer, so if you are just coming across, I'm sorry if you have already been here. I apologize, but yeah, we've got a new computer, and some of the equipment has come across, and some of the equipment hasn't. Wires everywhere around me, and it actually before we started, the reason it was delayed is because I couldn't get the camera to work. So apparently I got the camera to work, and somehow must have unplugged the microphone in the process without noticing. So thank you to everyone in the chat for telling me. But yes, Wagon Wheel, Jarrod Kimber. We still don't have super chats yet, I believe, although you can certainly try and give me money on the super chat. But what we do have at the moment is still the Patreons. And obviously, if you support us on Patreon, you can ask a question, and I've already answered these questions. So I should be absolutely a genius at these now that I've gone through the first, few questions. But we're going to start again with Miraj's question, who says, in Marquisi's book, War Minus the Shooting, he shares that the gates were open in second innings of West Indies-Kenya game in Pune. What other measures can the ICC take for non-Indian games, which will surely have less uptake considering a very, very low migrant population compared to England? Yeah, I mean, it's not like England. I mean, there are some England games that have good crowds, but I've been to plenty of World Cup games in England that haven't had particularly good crowds as well. But it is different. You're right. The opening the gate in the second innings is not a particularly good idea because no one can plan their day around that. So it doesn't make any sense. It's a terrible, terrible way of doing it, if we're being honest. So no, you should never do that. But what they should do is they should make every game essentially 100 rupee entry if India's not playing. They're not selling these tickets for enough that is making enough money in advance. And the ICC can actually fund this out of the rights package. They could say to the BCCI, look, your expected earnings from these games is this. We will, you can still sell your corporate hospitality or anything else you would like to sell. I'm pretty sure boards do that, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's with the ICC. I'm not sure. But essentially, all general admission tickets, 100 rupees. Gets people into the games and makes it look a lot better. Then you've got outreach stuff, right? How many local schools are there? Can you bust the schools in? Are there other community organizations that you can bring in? All those sorts of things. Maybe it is free tickets rather than 100 rupees. Depending on locations and particular things. But I think that is the best way of doing it. But this is a problem for cricket all around the world. We play a lot of cricket that is broadcast with fairly empty stands. And cricket boards haven't really worked out a way to make people want to come anymore. And one thing I would say is we don't discuss this enough. Watching cricket at the ground is a fantastic experience. But you do have to know a lot about cricket to watch cricket from the ground because you are minimum 60 meters away from the action. Watch cricket with someone under the age of 8 at a cricket ground. You really understand. It's like a code they don't understand that's unfurling in front of them. Cricket with the long lens cameras, where the action is in the middle, quite often makes a lot more sense when you're watching it on TV. And I don't think we've been honest enough as cricket people that is a part of the reason why people don't go to the ground as much. There's many other reasons. Many of the stadiums around the world are not up to scratch, and it's hot a lot of the time, blah, blah, blah. I could go on forever, but that is a huge part of it. James says, does Cricket South Africa's refusal to recognise pre-1991 players represent the views of the majority of South African cricket fans? And if not, will Cricket South Africa ever eventually come around? Do you know what? I know there are people who are annoyed about it. it's, I don't know if it is one of those things that annoys everyone. I think anyone who likes history is probably annoyed by it, even if it doesn't matter what side of the argument you're on, right? Um, if you like history, there's a part of you that's like, but they did play for South Africa. We have stats of them. They literally went out there and played. They were the best players available to be picked at that time under a racist system, right? And they played. And it wasn't just a racist system, of course. You know, the Afrikaans players were also kept out of cricket at a certain in a certain way. It was kept as a very white English South African game. If that phrase makes sense at all. And my big theory with it has always been you can't erase your history. You have to own it. And the first South African players were, I should know who's in that first team, but you know, Jimmy Sinclair and those sorts of guys. They went out there against much better England teams and gave everything they had, right? Would they have been better off if they'd been backed up by players who were not just picked because of their skin color? Yes, probably. But that doesn't change the entire situation. And so I do think from that perspective, it's a very, very important, you know, I think it's a very, very important thing. However, Cricket South Africa has just gone through a racial hearings. There's obviously so many other issues there. This is the sort of thing that the only reason I would never fight for it or, you know, make a huge deal about it consistently is just because like they have bigger things to worry about and it's not the end of the world. But I think it's unfair for the players who went out there, you know, that it wasn't their fault that the system was the way that it was. They still had to go and face fast bowling. They still had to spin the ball both ways. They still had to do all the things that cricketers have to do, put their body on the line. And they did it for, you know, for their country. Was it a broken country at the time? Yes. But if you go through the history of cricket, right, all the way through, you will find that a lot of cricket nations have not picked players from certain regions, have not picked players because of their class, have not picked players because of their race, have not picked players. I mean, women's cricket, right? You know, you've got women South African cricketers who played before 1991 were already struggling, right, to get any recognition in their own country as cricket, and now they're being told that they don't exist. That if you played for a women's game for South Africa before 1991, it doesn't exist. It doesn't sit right to me, to the individual people. And also, I just don't like the idea that you don't like your history, so that's not your history. Of course, it's your history. The colonization, the apartheid was their history, so as much as the history before that was their history as well. Rudra says, how good was Yashpal Sharma's batting for India in the 1983 World Cup? Semba Bowles' recent piece on the World Cup final and the previous matches in the tournament seem to all feature quality performances from him. Yeah, he was fantastic in that tournament. The one thing I would say is that we don't have as much footage from that tournament as we should, partly because not all the games were broadcast. I don't know how many were actually broadcast in the end, but there's no doubt that I would have said at least half of them were not. And at that stage, I think West Indies, Australia, Zimbabwe were in that group. So the West Indies and Australia would have been the games that would have been more likely to be broadcast. Overall, I would have thought. You know, there's that whole thing about the BBC went on strike and we don't have capital depth. The BBC weren't the reason there wasn't cricket footage of that, normal footage of that game. The reason we don't have the India-Zimbabwe game is because there was a strike and the news footage wasn't there, but it was never actually supposed to be a broadcast game anyway. So that gets mixed up, I think, sometimes in the retelling. But Sharma's innings, when you go through, you know, high scores in low totals, you know, really quality innings. I think I saw one of them. I think I've got some notes on him somewhere recently, and there's no doubt that he was good. But his problem first is we can't go back and watch it. All right. So Steve Elworthy tells a great story about the 1999 semi-final, Australia South Africa, is shown so often that and obviously when he worked for the ECB and now probably for Surrey as well, there's always a TV with cricket being played around him, and his staff, I'll actually say, "Oh, you're about to get hit for six here." Compare that to Sharma, where most Indian fans will never have seen it. And the other thing I think was an issue for him is he didn't have a career that backed up that. So if you think of Jeff Allett, James Faulkner. We've had players who've had sensational World Cups, Gary Gilmore, right? But they haven't actually played any other cricket at that level or for a long period of time. And so all you have is that World Cup. And so the memory doesn't stick around as long. Bloody Bogger says, how would you compare and contrast Pat Cummins with Glenn McGrath? You don't say here whether this is Test or ODI. So let's just start with Test. They have very, very similar figures in Test cricket, especially against the top order of the data that we have for Glenn McGrath, which is the second half of his career. One big difference for me is that Cummins has only ever bowled in a bowler-dominant era. McGrath bowled half of his career in a bowler-dominant era, and then the second half of his career in a batting-dominant era, and still was unplayable. And it's a bit when you're comparing Dale Steyn to other bowlers, right? Dale Steyn basically only bowled when batters were on top, and yet was still Dale Steyn. And you have to factor that in. And Cummins has had a completely different kind of ride. I think it's fair to say. And so from that perspective, it would be very, very hard to say that it's very hard to compare them. And they have similar numbers. So you have to give McGrath the edge. McGrath played more matches, will probably take more wickets and have a longer career. Obviously, part of that is Cummins' injury. But that's also, remember that McGrath came into the team, wasn't quite fully formed, had to play and work his way through and become the cricketer he was. Whereas Cummins actually, his body and his mind to mature while he was injured and then came back. So there are some differences. If you're talking about overall GOAT pace Australian bowlers, and you're including the white ball, then McGrath is by far and away better than Cummins at the moment. McGrath was undisputedly in his era the greatest white ball bowler. The only other thing I would add is that McGrath did all of his with the new ball, and Pat Cummins has done a lot of his work with the first change ball. And if Pat Cummins ever does become a permanent first change bowler again, he could arguably be the best first change bowler since Joel Garner, and that that is huge, right? To have a first change bowler of the level of Cummins and Garner and still be able to have a bowling average of 20, 21, 22, those sorts of numbers is absolutely ridiculous. So from that's the one thing I would sort of pull back into Cummins' favour, but I think McGrath's better than him. I think Cummins would have to have an incredible back half of his career, and I don't think he will. Not that I think he'll have a bad one, but I don't think he'll have the back half of his career where he's going to average under 22 for another 6 years or something like that. Mirad says, in street cricket, we often play a double innings, limited overs game, much like what Tendulkar proposed for ODIs. How would teams go about it if ODIs were split into two halves of 25 innings, one new ball for each innings? The question that I don't know here is whether you are keeping your wickets. So if you go out in the first game, can you play in the second game? Because when Australia did this in List A cricket for their, Matador, ING, McDonald's Cup games, you kept the wickets. So if you'd lost 2 wickets, you went into the next game with 8 wickets down. And it meant that teams just were really defensive and weird. And they would block out the overs before the break. And it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. If you're saying in this situation that you keep your you have 10 wickets in both games that you have, then it's just 2 T20 games, right? And I don't really see what the point of that would be. Vivek says, what does Benny Howell need to do to impress the IPL owners to get an IPL stint? Bolt 90 miles an hour? Start calling himself a leg spinner? It's ridiculous that he hasn't played more high-level T20 cricket already. His record is so strong. He's a very good fielder as well. He can hold the bat. But the truth is that most people within cricket, if you ask them, will tell you he's rubbish. I'll tell you he bowls dodgy little medium paces on crappy wickets, and that's why he gets wickets. And it's not true, right? I mean, it's quite obviously not true. It's been proven wrong time and time again. And there is a real bias against the fact that he looks like a medium pacer. Honestly, I think if Benny Howell 5 years ago decided to come in like a spin bowler and do exactly what he's doing now, he would have played a lot more top-level T20 cricket around the world. It's such a weird thing to say, but we've seen it with Rajat Bhattacharya, and who's the other guy? The West Indian. Oh, God, I've forgotten his name. That played for a couple of years as well. There's there's a bias against people who do it in a weird way, and in cricket they just think that it's bad wickets that get them the spells and everything else. So or people trying to hit them out the ground, which I would have thought is part of the deal. But essentially, within cricket, I think most analysts agree that he should have had more of a chance at the top level. I think most coaches think that it's a joke, and he shouldn't even be asking them about him. Also, I don't think he's a player who plays very well in the nets, because if you watch him at his best, I know he gets a lot of bowls, of course, but he gets a lot of catches caught at long on and long off. And I get the feeling that when he's in the nets, it looks like people are hitting him better. And I've heard that with some spinners before at times as well, that you kind of have to see them in the game to understand, oh, okay, that would have been caught, and okay, that one would have been hit for 6, but the next ball he would have been out, and that sort of thing. So I do think that is part of the issue. But look, sadly, his best is probably beyond him now. Sorry, Benny, if you're listening, but I'm not sure he's now the force he was. For those of us who were lucky enough to see him at his absolute best, he was absolutely incredible. He was essentially bowling spin at a very, very fast pace, and he had 15 to 20 different deliveries. No one's ever been like him before, and maybe will ever be. Well, I think someone will be like him again, and I hope that we continue to see bowlers like him. But his career is sadly not going to be maximized. Will says, people often say that 2007 World Cup format was the best. However, is that still true given that teams don't play ODIs as regularly? Only 3 group games could lead to some seriously weird results. Does the tournament nowadays need some fat? Or at least a robust qualification process? Yeah, I think, look, regardless, I think if you're going to have a World Cup, you have to have a proper qualification process. I can't see any way forward without having one, because teams don't even put their best players out anymore. And one-day cricket's probably going to get less and less bilaterals. We have to get to a position where we have more games being played at a when they matter. And I think if ODI cricket is going to stick around, I've got a project, an article and video about that coming out tomorrow on the main channel. But there's a very good argument to say that a qualification process is. I suppose, Will, I would say I care a lot more about the qualification process than I do the actual tournament. All I really want from the tournament is a lot of teams. From the qualification process, I want it to be that the best teams make it. Nadika says, was Stumpy the elephant from the 2011 World Cup a great mascot or the greatest mascot? Anyone in the comments is more than welcome to talk about the difference between to name another mascot other than Stumpy in cricket. Like, it's the only one I know. To be honest, I only know about Stumpy because Andy Zaltzman never stops banging on about it. And every time we do a podcast, like, he brings up Stumpy. So that's the only reason I really know about Stumpy. I know I have the zebra from the 2003 World Cup. I don't know where it is. I don't know if it's still my parents' place. I don't know if my kids play with it. I don't notice. And I also have, and I have no idea what it is, but an animal of some kind that I think was a mascot from the 2015 tournament from the New Zealand side of things. So I've got some kind of an animal there, but I don't know what any of their names are. So, I mean, Stumpy wins just because everyone else is completely different from that perspective. Let's have a look. Where are we next? I've completely lost my... That's what I wanted to get rid of. We'll have a quick break. Sorry again if you were in the chat before and the sound went out. But, I mean, if you were in the chat before and the sound went out, you missed just some of my best stuff. Absolutely huge. But you're listening to Wagon Wheel, and I'm Jarrod Kimber.
I know that you think you could run your favourite cricket team better than those who do. But no one is going to let you do that. So why not try Wicket Cricket Manager to satisfy that urge? Pick your nation, pick your league, pick your players, and yell at them when they do poorly. You can find it in the links below or by searching for Wicket Cricket Manager in your app store today.
Step into the World of Cricket podcast with me at the Jarrod Kimber Podcast Network. Be part of our live recordings or listen to insightful conversations 4 times a week. Wagon Wheel, Uncovered, Footmarks, and Red Inker. These shows cover kind of everything across the game. If you like what we do on this channel, you're probably going to enjoy the podcast we do as well. Support us on Patreon and help us keep making our content. Join for exclusive perks like the AMAs, the live calls, and to chat with me directly on Discord. You can also enjoy ad-free content, early podcasts, and access to my emailer. Step up your cricket style game with Bodyline t-shirts. Explore their exclusive player-themed t-shirts, including favourites like Virat Kohli, Kane Williamson, and Ben Stokes. They also have team-inspired designs and options for hardcore cricket nerds. Their collection offers something unique for every fan. Welcome back to Wagon Wheel. Jarrod Kimber here. Rudra says, is there an argument for saying that ODIs are the hardest format for bowlers because you can't go all out for wickets like in Test, but you also can't be content with going at little under 6 and over if you're not taking any wickets? I would say Test cricket's the hardest format for bowlers just because the physicality of it. I don't think anything else can ever compare with that. If you talk to a fast bowler about the third spell of their day, it's just a hugely physical, fourth spell in some cases. It's just a hugely physical, draining thing to be able to do. I think there are tactical things, Rudra, that are different in one-day cricket and T20 cricket. I remember talking to Mitch McClenaghan when we were at St. Lucia together, and I gave him a bunch of numbers that I thought would help him because he was trying to take wickets. And he said, no, I don't want to know about that. I just want to know where people score and where people don't score. And I found that really interesting because he was such an attacking bowler. And I realized that even in T20 cricket, and he might have been the most attacking bowler because he really didn't seem to, the way that he went about taking his wickets was so drastically different than everyone else. And yet, he didn't worry about that, that side of things as well. So perhaps from a tactical point of view, one-day cricket, it's that combination of taking wickets. Also, you've got a crappy ball for a long period of time as well, although less so now with the two new balls. But still, those balls do get quite old. So, towards the end especially, you're bowling with a pretty poor ball in those games. So yeah, maybe the tactical side of that is a little bit tricky. T20 cricket is a more reactionary sport, and I suppose one-day cricket you might have to be a little bit more proactive in that way. Ben says, streaming seems massively, I think I've pronounced that correctly for you, Ben, underused by cricket compared to other sports. Pay X amount for a year to watch every England game on our ECB Streams app or some other overly funky name. They could still have traditional broadcast deals with Sky and BT. So I might get the years wrong here, but I want to say around 2012 to 2015, there was a movement under Giles Clark they got the domain cricket.tv, and the idea was that everyone would sign up and you'd be able to, from your domestic cricket, your women's cricket, even disability cricket. Like I think the whole idea was anything you had a camera on would be on this app, and then every individual fan in the world could sign up for what they wanted, just India international games or just county games. Whatever you wanted, you had the option to be able to do. But the cricket boards all hate each other, and it would have required a overall structure from the ICC. And every time that has happened, they have fought that because they don't want. So cricket boards run the bilateral matches, right? The minute you bring in the ICC run that, and the cricket boards will be less powerful. That is why we don't have better streaming. Individually, I don't understand it as much from an individual nation by nation side of things. I think it's just short-sightedness, realistically. It's not the way, I would have thought that even if you are, I don't know, maybe India doesn't work as well, although it could, but if you're Australia, say, and you're Cricket Australia, you've already got a really good YouTube/website presence. They've already got media products, I suppose is the best way of putting it. Why not then have a proper streaming system where you're actually buying streaming rights also for overseas tours and maybe even other leagues and stuff, at a discount for your streaming platform from the other boards directly, and then doing a similar deal with the other boards and everything else. But again, they don't really do this. So you'd probably only get home cricket, and the boards are already selling that. But you're right. It's a concern, and they're now 10 years out of date. They could have been. I mean, I think the original model was based on baseball. It might have been from Mike Jenkman's book that they got the idea. I'm not sure, or maybe they thought of it on their own. I don't know. But I mean, as a basketball fan, I can watch every basketball game in the world. Every NBA game in the world. FIBA's a whole different ball game. They charge way too much for crappy basketball a lot of the time. But the NBA, I can watch every NBA game. I can do the same with, obviously other American sports. That is where sport is going, right? So it seems to me a mistake not to have capitalized on that when we know that's the direction that it's going. Ian says, Alistair Cook has played 5 seasons of county red ball cricket since retiring from tests. With the way that the game has changed over the last 20 years, will he be the last player of his caliber to go back for such a prolonged period? I don't know him well enough to know if he just wanted to keep playing. I remember when he was in the West Indies, we were all staying at the same hotel, and he was going through his fitness regime like he was still playing. And I thought to myself at the time, this is someone who just still wants to play cricket. Maybe doesn't want to deal with all the nonsense of the England side of things, but this is someone who definitely still wants to play cricket. I don't think that will stop Ian. If you look at some of the footballers now, they go to other leagues, right? And I know money is a factor, but they're also, in some cases, getting paid less and they hang on. Like, players do hang on as long as their bodies allow. It doesn't happen all the time, but it certainly does happen in some sports that, players will go back and play amateurly just because they love the sport. Now, the one thing I would say is in the future, as we get more and more towards professionalism, the only reason I would say that will happen less often is because we will milk the bodies even more of these players by the look of things. And the only other reason I would say that is that I think traditionally the people who've done it have been huge cricket fans. And perhaps as cricket gets more professional, it becomes more an athlete-driven sport, and therefore not everyone who plays the sport will like cricket. And so there's a smaller, portion of people who might even be able to do this. But no, I don't think Alistair Cook will be the last player to do that. So if it's in your blood, it's in your blood, right? Andy says, Charlotte Edwards seems to be a winning machine for different teams, different formats, different countries, countries, different levels of players. She just creates winning sides. What is she doing differently? Could she work in the men's game if she wanted to? It feels like crossovers will happen in the future at some point. I don't know. I haven't been close enough to it, but it is something I do want to find out. I don't know her particularly well, and every time I've ever tried to interview, I haven't got much out of her. If it was someone else who I thought I could interview a bit, I'd love to get to the bottom of what she's doing differently. I always loved her as a player, so I'm really fascinated with the coaching stuff. Could she work in the men's game if she wanted to? Yes. We've already got a couple of crossover people when it comes to coaching. Not as many as we should, and there will be a lot more of that in the future. And she would certainly be someone who could. I'm not sure she wants to, and I think that is a really important part of it. Someone asked me this recently on one of our chats. Might have been Ian actually. He was saying, does she want to do it? Or no, should she do it? And I said, I don't think it's a case of whether she should do it or not. It's a case of whether she wants to. And I'm not sure that it's, women's cricket is growing so quickly, and she's an absolute expert in that. She would have to change what she does a little bit for men's cricket. They are different formats and, different strands of the same game. There's the same way, and it's exactly the same with when the men's coaches go over to women's cricket. I've talked to lots of guys who've done this before, and they're like, yeah, you have to change the way you communicate, but also what you were talking about, what the knowledge base is, what the technique capabilities of different players are, and all those sorts of things. So from that perspective, Andy, she would have to do that. And I'm just not sure that that's what Charlotte Edwards wants. James says, it's commonly held that Australia were terrible in the mid-80s, but a cursory reading of the results from that period seems to show that they're at least competitive in most of their series other than against the West Indies, who are now generally acknowledged as one of the GOAT test sides. If not the GOAT, were they really that bad? Is this perception due to high expectations of the Australian public? The contrast with the success of the Chappell era and the Border era afterwards. Destabilizing effect of rebel tours. Don't forget Kerry Packer was in all that. So there's a lot to unpack here, James. The best thing the easiest way of saying it is there were 7 strong test teams at that time. Australia was the 4th best. Sri Lanka start in the 80s, so we won't have them in that. And Australia was the 4th best, but they had a win percentage well under 50%. Win-loss ratio, I should say, well under 50%. So they were not a strong team. Yes, they were in some series, but they weren't really, a threat. West Indies were better than them. Pakistan was certainly better than them. New Zealand was better than them in that era. But also, some of this gets conflated because essentially it's from the start of the Kerry Packer series until about the end of, until really Border takes over and they win the World Cup in '87. Say, up until that period, they probably were very poor at times. But that's also because the Rebel Tours happened. There were injuries, the retirements, the Kerry Packer thing. All these different things destabilized that team at that time. So all those things have to be factored in. But also, coming in, Australia were the best team in the world and had been in the best team or in the best 2 teams, or at worst in the best 3 teams from, 1878 until 1978. So what, 100 years of being automatically the best team, the second best team, or at worst the 3rd best team. And now they were the 4th best team. And they were no longer in conversation. New Zealand, who they refused to play New Zealand. And New Zealand didn't even want to play them as well because they were so much better than them. And now suddenly New Zealand were the better team. Pakistan were not really a force in cricket until the 80s. They were better than Australia. Like teams that shouldn't have been better than Australia were better. And even, it's funny you say they were in some of those. I mean, England was quite a poor team in the 80s. And England beat them consistently in the 80s. Yes, they were in those series, but they weren't particularly a good team. So I think it was all those things came together, but Australian fans weren't ready for the team to be that poor. And to be honest, that might have been the poorest era over a decade stretch that Australian cricket's ever had. It's not a particularly poor era, as you point out, but certainly is for Australia from that perspective. I've done a podcast with Jeremy Coney, which will be out after the World Cup. And we compared the 2 New Zealand eras, the early 80s era to the World Test Championship winning era. And one thing that we have to tell people is, New Zealand can't beat Australia these days, and they get absolutely smashed. But that New Zealand team beat the Australians, but you have to go back and have a look at it and look at the actual sides, and you realize that, Australia's main bowler was Greg Matthews. I think he bowled the most balls against New Zealand in that era, and had a bowling average of, 45, 47? So it was dire at times, James, right? If you're an Australian fan and you're watching Greg Matthews come in and bowl over after over of no wickets, and you were used to Dennis Lilly, it's going to great. Ruja says, let's say in a T20 game, there's a rough patch in the pitch on the slot. What kind of batters and bowlers would deal with this best? The bowlers are the most accurate ones, right? So, Kumar, Vernon Philander, Jimmy Anderson, if you've got him, I suppose. Those sorts of bowlers who can just hit a spot are going to be at the best. And the batters are going to be the Kane Williamson, Virat Kohli, anchor-type players, your high-level anchors who have the ability to deal with that sort of stuff, assuming that the bowlers are good enough to be able to hit that spot regularly. We don't see it very often. I do remember a CPL game I was watching on TV where, I don't know if it was damp or there was a part of the pitch that was playing up a little bit and the bowlers sort of kept hitting this spot and it did cause problems. But most T20 wickets are pretty solid. If they're bad, they're just bad. They're not bad because of something like this. Will says, if this World Cup was a 14-team World Cup, which 4 extra teams do you think would have qualified? So Ireland would have qualified, Zimbabwe would have qualified, West Indies would have qualified, Scotland would have qualified. And what impact would they have had on the tournament? Well, it'd be a different shaped tournament then, wouldn't it? So, the biggest impact they would have had is that it wouldn't have been the round robin tournament that we currently have. Big fan of Dutch cricket, and don't want Peter Boren hunting me down in my sleep or anything. But I kind of wanted Zimbabwe to qualify just because I thought of all those teams, they probably had the best go of playing in Asia. I know they've got good fast bowlers as well, but their players are quite good at manipulating spin. That it spins quite a lot in Zimbabwe, and they had an off spinner and a leg spinner in their top 6, top 7, maybe depending on where Ryan Bell ends up. Whether they were good enough to consistently beat teams in the World Cup, I don't know. I don't know where they would have gone, but I would have been very, very interested to see where they would have gone in this tournament. So they would have had a shot. There would have been a game where maybe someone like George Munsey could have done something for Scotland. West Indies, Puran would, certainly Puran and Hetmeyer together in that fantasy world where they both play. In the West, where are they playing? In India would be an interesting middle order. And who's the other team? Ireland. I think Ireland would have struggled, maybe in the same way that I'm expecting Netherlands to struggle. Zimbabwe and the West Indies are the ones where they could have made a run for it just based on a couple of players standing up. Sikandar Raza keeps playing the way he has been, for instance. There's no reason why they couldn't, do something a little bit interesting on occasions. But they'd be spoiler teams. But because of the 14 team World Cup, it would just be a different tournament. And I think that's the most important thing. Thank you to everyone on Patreon. What we will do is take a short break here now that I finally got through all those questions. Got to be proud of me for doing all those questions twice. Well, you don't have to be proud of me. Proud of me is probably the wrong word. You've got to admire I did all those questions twice. We'll be back in a moment and I'll see if there's any questions in the room. We don't have super chats, so pretty much anything you ask in the room, I can have a look at. There's some interesting questions there already. I have now been talking for an hour, even if people could only hear it for 40 minutes. I have been talking for an hour, but I'll certainly, if you have anything interesting in the chat, I'll get to it. But for now, on Wagon Wheel, let's have a break. If you follow my work, you'll be very tired because I produce a metric arse ton of content and I can't do all of that myself. I also can't afford an army of people to do it for me. So what I needed was a solution to get all my analysis, hot takes, and random asides out on social media. And I found that with Memento, the AI tool that basically takes all of my work and cuts it up, makes it look pretty, and pushes it all over the internet. If you have content and you need to repackage it, use Memento. If you enjoy our content, we ask you to hit the like button, subscribe, or drop a comment along the lines of, "Wow, Jarrod, your vibes are immaculate." Additionally, sharing our work on social media, supporting us in super chats, and helping us out on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee all mean the world to us. Like our stuff? Please support us by whacking that subscribe button like it's a short ball. Or you could just leave a comment expressing your admiration, such as, "Wow, Jarrod, you're the Aubrey Faulkner of YouTubers." Also, please help us spread the word by sharing our work across social media, back us on Patreon, or also support us with live super chats. All right, welcome back to... What are we called? Wagon Wheel. I'm Jarrod Kimber. I forgot my name, actually. I remember the name of the show, and I was like, well, what else do I need to say here? Jarrod Kimber, Wagon Wheel. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. I've lost one. Someone pulled... Oh, no, there's one there. Great. Yeah, so if you do have any last questions, I know a lot of people just dropped off of the chat because of the 16 minutes I was talking to myself. But if you are in the chat and you want to put in a question, I've only got a couple here, so you need to get in quite quick. And which is DM95 did. He got in so quick, in fact, that he went beforehand. He said, if both remain consistently fit, who would be remembered as a better bowler, Shane Bond or Jofra Archer? It's a really interesting question, this one. Because I'm a huge fan of Shane Bond, but I think that Jofra Archer ultimately has more weapons than Shane Bond. Perhaps late career Shane Bond got to the point where he didn't have to bowl at 90 miles an hour anymore and could use his other skills to be successful. But early in his career, that was certainly not the case. And he needed that pace. Where we saw early in Jofra's career is just like, I'm going to bowl at 85 miles an hour here and still no one will be able to hit me. So I do think that I'd probably pick Jofra Archer on that. But there is something about the fact that because he was so injured, Shane Bond actually became very clever, but maybe we never quite got to see the extra cleverness of his bowling. But he was an incredible bowler. 2003 World Cup is probably when the world got to see it the most. And I thought he was fantastic at that point. Raj says, can you talk about the year difference from years 1987 to 1992 and 3 years from 1996 to 1999? So what Raj is asking about here is the fact that the World Cups weren't always 4 years apart. There's a few reasons for this, right? The first one is that cricket was incredibly amateur in those days, Raj. And the reason that it was easy to do originally was they're all in England. So 1975, 1979, 1983 all made sense because it was in England. Once they started to put in summers and Southern Hemisphere summers and other summers in other parts of the world and all those sorts of things, it became a lot trickier, right? But the real reason is they weren't planning them far enough in advance. We now plan World Cups 8 years in advance, I think. I think that's right. More often than not, when we can. And so what we have as a situation now is we can make sure that they're only ever spaced 4 years. But you're talking about a fairly amateur sport. It wasn't $1 billion event back then, Raj. So at that stage, what you had was a situation where it wasn't being organized correctly. It wasn't really. I mean, the fact that they kept playing them in England without even moving them out tells you, Raj, that they weren't. It wasn't like they were all sitting around having these big meetings about how things should go. So it was a little bit different from that perspective. And I do think, that if it was run more professionally, they would have done it slightly smoother. But we now basically have two windows, right? So we have England plays theirs in the middle of their summer, but the rest of the world essentially play either in March, April, or February, March, whatever you want to call it, and October, November. And as we move on, it looks like more and more tournaments are just going to be in October, November, because that's almost been set up just for international events at the moment. And so because of that, it's a lot probably easier to plan now, whereas back in the old days, there was all these other things. There was also I think there were things around when other events were in the country, whereas again, now cricket the World Cup is so big in cricket now, it is a major event on its own. It wasn't a major event in 1979, right? It wasn't a major event in 1987. So as it becomes more and more important, it can pick the spots and go up against other sports, even if it has to where it wants to and all those sorts of things. So I think that's all changed. But that's I would say it's mostly just about when the schedules were available and they weren't thinking that far in advance, would be my guess. Lokesh says, do you think coding AI would help as a statistician's career in future? Yeah, we're already starting to do that. Certainly coding is already a big part of what, maybe not statisticians. I don't know about statisticians because I'm not really a statistician, but in analysis, we already use coding. And AI is, another way of using coding better going ahead. So I certainly think that is something. If you want to get into it yourself, and I've just seen your next message, CricSheet is the way to go. You'll find all the ball by ball information there. Everything else is kind of behind paywalls and everything else, but CricSheet have everything available from a ball by ball situation. And that's the best way. And if you want to know how to get into the industry, tell teams things they don't know. That's all anyone wants to know. Things that they don't know. And if you can find the key decision makers on LinkedIn, and they're all on LinkedIn, contact them with information that they don't know. And that's your best bet. Tino, we'll finish off with Tino. Has he got a picture of Joel Embiid? Don't know if I should be answering this. What was your favorite bat as a kid, and what are you using these days? As a kid, there was a bat in Australia called Ulysses, which I think Viv might have used briefly at one stage. I think most of my friends wanted to use V100, V500, V800s. They were really, really popular where I was from. Kookaburras weren't particularly popular. I used a Grey Nichols Power Spot. Grey Nichols, again, weren't massively popular when I was growing up. My first bat was a County, which is the bat. If you go back and look at I think it was another Victorian brand. You could see in Dean Jones and Merv Hughes, I think, used County bats. I think maybe Cameron might have been using one when he first came through as well. So that was the first bat I had. My dad bought me that bat. I then bought an SS Jumbo, which I think I would have bought around the time that Viv was with them. I don't think I bought it for that reason, though. I think I bought it because it was really cheap. And the current bat, the County I had, I'd kind of grown out of. And I just bought a SS Jumbo, and I wanted to hit sixes, really. My dad was furious that I didn't buy a proper bat. And he's probably right. It was probably way too heavy, but geez, I hit some sixes with that thing. Then I had the Power Spot for quite a few years, and I broke the toe on that. And I got I want to say my next bat was Lachlan Fisher. So Lachlan Fisher was another Victorian bat maker who used to make bats for a lot of the Victorian players and some of the Australian players as well. And so I went to his factory in Yarraville, I think, and got his bat, which was absolutely great. Made my first 100 with the Fisher. And then not long, I'm going through the whole history now. I'm sorry, Tino, you've asked. And then not long after that, I realized I changed the way that I'd been batting. I'd been an opening batter, and as I got higher level in cricket, I got pushed down the order, and so I started using a much lighter bat, and the Fisher was a little bit too heavy for me, and so a friend of mine sold me his Gunner Moore Maestro. Someone had bought him a bat, and then he'd won a bat in a competition, and he sold me the Gunner Moore Maestro, which is like the Steve Waugh one. So it would have been around 2001. And that was incredible. My batting had been in a bit of funk, and getting that bat brought me completely back. It was really light. And then when I came to the UK, I got a Charlie French bat. And Charlie French is the Bruce French, the England wicketkeeper. It's his brother's bat making company. They make bats up in Nottingham, so a lot of Nottingham players over the years have used Charlie French bats before. It's the best bat I've ever used by an absolute distance. Beautiful. I love it. It suits exactly the way I go. I feel so confident using it. And then I was given a bat by Hawke, and so Hawke make bats in. Oh, what county? There's probably someone in the comments getting annoyed. God, I should know this. Is it Leicester? No, I can't remember. But they sponsored me, and they gave me a bat. I was playing in a lot of charity games and stuff in that stage, and cricket with balls was getting really big, and they gave me a bat. They actually gave my wife a bat as well. And the Hawke it's a sledgehammer. It's probably the most powerful bat I've ever used, but it's just too heavy for me. I've used it a couple of times when I open the batting, but I like the flexibility of being able to play reverse sweeps and flip the ball over my shoulder, and play pull shots at will off faster bowlers and everything. And the Hawke bat, I felt like I was a little bit so I still using my Charlie French. I'm playing a little bit more cricket now next year. Played a little bit more this year, and so I might upgrade. But I will go to a bat maker directly. I might, talk to the Green Nichols guys. They might laugh me off, but I'll talk. I want to go and find a bat maker, go in, show them how I bat and everything else, and do it the proper way. I don't need to do any of this, of course. I'm just a bit of a middle order slogger, more often than not. Although since I've hurt my arm, I've had to actually take batting seriously. That's probably why I have. That's probably why I have. That's probably why I will need another bat, is because I'm actually, taking my batting a little bit more seriously than I have probably since I had the Fisher bat back in the days. But yeah, no, I love bats. I have heaps. I don't know if you can see in my office. I've got a Bush Rangers bat here. So this was given to me by the Bush Rangers, but it's a Kookaburra bat. This was just because I set up their Facebook page way back in the day. I think in our house we have something like 20, 25 bats. I just got my son's. I think my wife bought one of my boys a bat, and I got the other one. So I think one's a GM, and I don't know what the other bat is off the top of my head. But yeah, so we're now getting into the kids' bats. So I'm getting excited again. I just bought them all their kit actually for next year. So thank you to Vinted. I just went on there and I figured at the end of the season, someone would be getting rid of their kids' stuff, and they were. Yeah, so we really started to get into all that sort of stuff. Yeah, I've always been fascinated with bats. I'm not a bat guy, 100%. I did the big, thing on Twitter where we went through, the most iconic bats in cricket, and it really upset the hard-nosed cricket bat guys because I left out a couple that they thought should be there, and they didn't want the Nike bat on, but I thought the Nike bat was a really interesting part of the iconic nature of cricket bats and everything else. And so, it's something I've always been fascinated with. I had my friends growing up who were the Duncan Fernley guys, right? And then and everyone else had their own different thing. I've never quite been as much like that. As you can tell, I've gone through quite a lot of bats. I think, yeah, even my gear is usually a bit of a mix of a few different things. But it's something I've always been really, really fascinated on. Russell Jackson, he's got some great old blog posts, which I hope are still active, where there's all the old magazine photos of all the old bats and all the different designs that came through. But yeah, I think for me, it was more about how a bat felt in my hand. I knew it was a big deal when I got the SS Jumbo and when I got the Grey Nichols, but I think it was more about how those things felt in my hand than what company they were with. So I'm maybe not quite like and there are certainly other people who are very different when it comes to that. Last one. Swami Nathan says, do you ever see Asian coaches becoming head coaches in the West beyond the current spin bowling consultant jobs? Yes, it will happen. I've talked about this before. I'm a bit shocked that it's taken this long. I know that coaching wasn't as developed in Asian countries from an international level, not an individual skills-based level, but from an international level. And Australia and South Africa specifically were so ahead of the game, I think, with everyone else, and maybe New Zealand as well, that there was certainly something there that caused part of that rift. But yeah, it's stupid that that teams aren't looking beyond that. And we've already seen, of course, Phil Simmons and Otis Gibson from the West Indies get coaching jobs outside of their home conditions. So we've had black coaches do it. So we know that Asians know a lot. Like who would say no to Mahela being their national coach? I don't think anyone would be doing that from any nation. So I'd be shocked if in the next 5 to 10 years that isn't just a thing. But a lot of it's just that as coaches develop, as coaching styles develop around the world as well, we might eventually have a run of, I don't know, Sri Lankan coaches or Bangladeshi coaches or Indian coaches or Pakistani coaches or whatever. The same sort of thing that we see in football. And that is essentially what we saw in cricket, right? We saw a run of Australian coaches, then a run of South African coaches, probably a run of New Zealand coaches in the middle of all that as well. So it's due for other places to have a go. Anyway, that's me. Thank you for that question. Thank you to everyone. Sorry about the start of the podcast, but hopefully I've made up for it. We've got World Cup starts. So when this episode's out, the World Cup will be on, which is weird and trippy, but that's just how life works sometimes, people. I can't explain the internet to you. But we have heaps of content. The Double Century series, if you haven't been listening to it, is a ripper. And I don't say that because I've written it brilliantly. It's just the stories. 75 or 73, 75, 79, 83. Is 87 up yet? I don't know if 87, 92, 96, and 99. I was going to go all the way through, but I ended up doing double parters. So those ones will be the last one. So it will finish at the end of the 1999 World Cup. But there's some incredible stuff in there. If you don't know that much, especially about some of those early World Cups, the hemorrhoid, operation is one of my favorite facts in cricket. If you don't know, you have to go back and listen. But yeah, just an absolutely brilliant series. But we've got so much World Cup stuff. Everything live for the World Cup on YouTube will be on the Jarrod Kimber podcast channel. And everything that we make, prepackaged and everything else will be on the main channel. And the podcast will be updated. Red Inca will probably become more of a midweek update on the World Cups rather than doing normal red inkers. We've got plenty of red inkers in the can for after the World Cup, but I think we'll move them back and we'll make it as much World Cup coverage as possible. Always excited for the World Cup. I think it's really the tournament where it's maybe the T20 World Cup as much as anything, but the One Day World Cup and the T20 World Cups are really the tournaments where I built my career, my notoriety and everything else very much comes from those events. So for me, every time one comes up, it's a huge deal. Thank you very much for supporting us and everything else. If you haven't downloaded Wicket Cricket Manager yet, just do it. It's just fun. Download Wicket Cricket Manager, and we will be back again next week. And next week, the World Cup will be here. Let's do this. Love sports and want to write or podcast on it? Look no further than Fans with Laptops. It's a specialized course tailored for aspiring sports enthusiasts like you. Uncover the secrets of the press box, learn how to create compelling stories from scratch, and discover the best methods to share your content online. Support us on Patreon. Join for exclusive perks like AMAs, live calls with me, and a vibrant Discord community. Enjoy ad-free content, early podcast episodes, and access to my emailer, plus behind-the-scenes stuff. We've built our channel on Patreon support, so a huge thanks to everyone who has helped.